and welcome into another tutorial of our Next.js series. So today we will be covering dynamic API routes, and in the past we talked how we can use dynamic routes for creating pages, and the same idea applies for API routes. So for pages we managed to create a post directory, and within that directory we could use some specific implementations of Next.js to inject dynamically parameter into our codes. So next to our post we can also see API, and that directory represents all the API endpoints available from Next.js. So if we expand into the API directory, we see that we have a hello file, and within the file we import some default Next.js types, and we also create a handler, and we make a default export of the handler. The signature of the handler includes a request and a response, and we use the response to set a status code of 200 and to return a JSON of an object with the key of name and the value of John Doe. We want to extend our endpoints. So before we actually extend our endpoint, let's make a call to the endpoint, and I will simply calling localhost 3000. And if you're wondering which relative path we need to use, then it should be API and the name of the file. So in our case it would be API hello. So I make that call, and as you see I get a valid response, a 200 response with the expected payload. So I will put that on the side so that we have easy good visibility of what we are doing with the endpoint, and also in our HTTP call. So if we want to extend our endpoints and create another one, then we can simply add a new file, and I will call it foo, and I need to import the request and the response type from Next. So that would be import type Next API request and Next API response, and I need to create a handler. So the handler will has the signature that we discussed before, and I'm also making a default export of the handler. And so the first parameter would be a request, so that would be Next API request, and the second parameter would be a response, which would be Next API response. We want to select what information is available from the request, so we can come here and see that we have headers, we have the HTTP version method, if it's the HTTP verb, so if it's a get, post, etc. And there is the query, so we can use that object to extract parameters provided in the request, run headers, and many others. So in our case we just want to return a 200 status code and a foo. So in that case I will be setting the status code, so that would be 200, and I want to return foo, so that would be I'll be returning a plain text with the value foo. So if I call that endpoint now, then I should get a 200 response, and as you see I get foo. Now let's try to introduce a dynamic parameter into our route, and I will be creating a similar structure of what we have for post in pages. So I will be creating a post directory within the API, and I will be also creating a file with the name ID. I use square braces to make that parameter dynamic, and I'm also creating the file. So I'll be copying what I have over here just to avoid repeating myself, and what I want to do is to extract the ID, and that would be request params, request the query, and here we have the ID, and I want to return that ID into my payload, and I will be updating using the JSON method so that I get a JSON object. So if I call my endpoint now and use post1, so we see that I get an object with the key of ID and the value of 1. So that's fine if we want to, if we're gonna have only a single parameter in our path. But if you want to provide multiple parameters, so we see that we get a 404, and that if that file won't be enough, so we can update the name of the file, and we can use a REST operator, and I will be also updating the name to be ID, since that will capture multiple IDs. And now if I try to make my call, so I need to update the name of the parameter as well. So now if I make my call, so we see that we get all the parameters into an array. So essentially Next.js aggregates all the parameters into an array, and it will provide us that array to us, so we can process it as we want. So, and it can't get like any number of parameters. The only issue with that is that when we only call pause, so we get a 404, so that won't pick the pause endpoint, and to make it work we need to include an index file and set the implementation of the function over there. So that's the most common practice, and it's aligned with the HTTP with the REST convention. So for example, when you make a call to post, you want to get all the posts available from your data stores, and you return them to the users. If you want to get a particular post, then that would be provided as a parameter, and the implementation of each functionality should be in a separate file. But if you want to have the whole functionality into a single endpoint, then you can also do the same. And you can update the file to use 2 square braces, so that's an optional catch-all path, and it will pick any parameters that you pass to the endpoint, including like if you're not passing any. So in that case, I make a call, I don't pass any parameters, so I get an empty object. But if I keep passing parameters to it, I see that I get all the parameters that I want. So I would discourage you for using the optional catch-all. I'm suggesting to use the catch-all routes, and also like if you want to get multiple resources from your data store, then just use a single file that separates, so you're fetching a single resource with fetching multiple resources. So the last thing that I want to cover is to explore a bit more of some other information available from the request and the response. So we have already talked about like what's provided from request, and one important piece will be cookies. So for example, we can get all the cookies available. We can get the cookies that are provided in the call. So in our case, I will be only logging that information. And if I come into my HTTP client, pass the cookie header and set name equals value, then I get into my logs that object. So Next.js by default uses cookies middleware that parse the cookies header, and it creates an object which we can use to extract all the cookies that are provided to us. So the same applies for the query object, and we can also extract the body of the payload. So when I would disable the cookie here, and usually we use a content type of application JSON, and with in the request payload we will include some information that we want the server to process it. So in our case I will use hello world, and that information will be available on the server so it can process it. So by default that's enabled from Next.js, but if you want to update the configuration and for example want to disable the parsing of the request body, then you can do so by updating the config. So in that case it will be API, and you need to disable the body parser. So now if I make the call, we see that we get undefined, and that's because we disabled the middleware. But yeah, I mean, usually you will need to have the middleware enabled so we can get the information that you want and process it based on the requirements of that specific endpoint. So I really like API routes into Next.js since it provides a lot of capability, and since you can use it in many different ways, and which usually it's a feature that is not available from single page applications. And in addition, Vercel, the official hosting platform of Next.js, recently introduced edge functions, and which can boost performance in terms of how those Lambda functions will be used in the Vercel platform, which is a great addition, and I think it will be very useful if you want to create like a scalable applications. So stay tuned for our next tutorial and see you next time. Thank you for watching.